Jesus followed all of these women. And even though they suffered, he was always there.
Yeah. And I think, that highlights why telling our stories is so important, because we see that Jesus follows us. He follows us into the places of pain and suffering, and that he's not scared of it.
Hey, I'm Maddison Virtunis.
And I'm Jessica Leap-Fick.
Here's to Speak is really about loving the people who are around you and learning that faith and spirituality can be a normal part of your conversation with them.
We realize that talking about Jesus and faith can feel really awkward and uncomfortable, but we believe each of us can listen, learn, and love people better.
We're here today wrapping up Series 2 called Her Story Matters, where we interviewed 3 incredible ladies, Rachel, Seiko, and Emma. And let's just remind ourselves what these episodes were about. So Rachel's was From Buddha to Jesus. Seiko's was From Homeless to Hope-Filled. And Emma's was From Happily Married to Single Mom.
Yeah. Each of these stories was so incredible. And so we just wanted to take a minute to look back on what these stories meant to us and to hear what they meant to you guys.
Yes, we would love to hear what you thought about the second series and what you learned, what some of your highlights were, and maybe how you related to their stories.
Yeah, we know women's stories are powerful. And so we wanted to highlight these 3 women who've had some pretty painful things happen in their lives, but yet have overcome them through the power of Jesus and God showing up in some pretty amazing ways. So, Maddison, what were some highlights for you from each of these interviews?
When I think about interviewing Rachel, she told us a little bit about what it was like growing up in a Buddhist family and how that really didn't satisfy her spiritually or emotionally, and how she spent a majority of her teen years in college years seeking God, and how he met her and how the love of God really overcame her, and she began following Jesus at that point. So her story to me was just really powerful of how tangible God can be in our lives when we're seeking him out.
Yeah.
And I remember we asked her, what does your faith look like today?
Right. Yeah.
And she said, my faith to me looks like sitting on my porch in the silence.
God showing up.
And God shows up there.
Yeah.
And she started crying at that point.
We all started crying.
Wow, I know. And I was
episode.
like, oh my gosh, that's so true. It's so simple. And it's just God shows up.
Yeah.
Especially in the silence.
Hers was such a cool story of the community of believers just showing up to love her. The way she describes it was almost as if they didn't realize how powerful their love was as an example of Jesus. I had heard, I forget who, a theologian, talk about how community is the most powerful apologetic for the Christian faith. That when you step into environments, when you actually feel tangible love, when people show up for you, when they pray for you, they listen to you, that demonstrates something powerful. And I think it was cool to see Rachel enter into that, and that just draw her to Jesus in that silent, still place. No one led her to Jesus. No, she didn't pray the prayer. She just met Jesus in the silence, which was so cool.
It reminds me of when God created us and he gave Adam Eve and how he said, it's not good for man to be alone.
Yeah.
And I heard recently someone say, actually, God isn't enough for us because God said it wasn't good for us to be alone. And when Adam was in the garden, he wasn't alone. God was there. So if that wasn't good, then that means that's why God gives us our communities. It's not just
know him and love him in community.
Yeah, it's not just for a spouse, because we know that not everybody gets married, but for community's sake as well. And so Rachel's was a really good story that showed us that. And then I loved interviewing Seiko and Emma as well, because we have friendships with them, and it's just really fun to bring a friend into something like this. And so
it was really incredible. Just when you know someone, a lot of times you just don't know the extent of their story or the depths of their story. You know a little bit about them, but to actually sit down and listen to them just share more about their lives was incredible.
What was the highlight for you?
Yeah, I think probably with both of them, hearing how God showed up in such practical, tangible ways in their suffering. Keep remembering Seiko talking about when her family was in Guam and they were basically, living on beaches and in friends' homes, like homeless. She talked about these nuns showing up and giving she and her siblings snacks. And I just loved her saying, we were hungry and then we weren't. And it just made me think so much about scripture, how Jesus talks about whoever you give to, you give to me. Basically like you're serving me when you serve people. And I felt like her story was such a powerful illustration of that. Like what we do matters, in serving others. So that was really, really beautiful in her really hard story of homelessness that has continues to play out in her relationships with her husband and her family. And I think I just appreciated too that she talked about just struggling still, like, that she didn't, it's not like the tied up in a nice bow. Cause I think a lot of times our stories tend to veer that way. Like, and then it was all good. But I think it's so powerful to hear, of like, it's not done. It's not wrapped up. Like there are still hard things. There's still painful things. Because I think that's more reflective of life than the fairy tale ending. Sometimes we really almost tend to go towards in our Christian faith of like, and then Jesus fixed it all. It's like, well, actually, we still suffer. There's still painful things. Like brokenness still affects us in our relationships for the rest of our lives. So
right. Yeah. So what about with Emma? What was something that you really loved about her episode?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Emma's just so fun to talk to. And
yeah, when we opened, she was like, thank you for having me. I don't even know why you would want to talk to me. And I was like, are you kidding?
I know. She cracks me up. It's so fun to get to work with her. Yeah, I think, again, like what I said, of you hear bits and pieces of people's stories. Like I knew that she went through a really painful divorce and really struggled as a single mom, but to hear what that was like for her emotionally and spiritually, and again, how Jesus showed up in some very, very specific ways was so powerful. Like, I mean, what for you from your episode?
We asked like about a turning point or something like that. And she was saying that I knew we were going to be okay the day that I mowed our lawn.
Right. Oh my gosh.
Because she was a single mom. Okay. And so like things like that are really difficult to get done.
Yeah.
Like,
especially if you've never mowed a lawn in your life.
Right. So she talked about like, I had to ask my neighbor if I could borrow his lawnmower. And then like, I could barely get it started. Right. And then when I did, I mowed that lawn and it looked terrible, but like I knew we were going to be okay because I did something like that. Yeah. And I was like, wow, what a picture that just painted.
Yeah, those physical, tangible turning points of like, yeah, this happened. I did that, or God showed up in this way was so cool.
Yeah. And there was a really good quote from her episode.
Oh man, I was like, tweet Emma.
Hashtag Emma tweets.
Hashtag Emma Reynolds sayings. Yeah. yeah, that line where she talked about, I didn't know when I chose to follow Jesus that he would follow me into the places of suffering.
That was
of pain. Like, man, we were wrecked.
That was powerful.
We just were wrecked when she shared that. And I think one of the things that you and I both learned, and that was surprising, was the amount of pain our friends have endured. Like, I think a lot of us don't share the really excruciating moments in life because it just feels awkward bringing them up in conversation. Like, so yeah, that time I went bankrupt and like couldn't afford to buy mushrooms, really a bummer. Or that time I went through being estranged with my family. Like those usually aren't the stories we share unless we're invited to. And so I just think,
and even when we are, like even if it comes up without like accidentally, when someone asks me like about my mom, like like. Where does your mom live?
Family, right?
It can be a little awkward because some people are caught off guard when I say like, oh, well, my mom has mental illness and a history of drug addiction. Yep. Like that's not necessarily like
cool. Glad you haven't had a barbecue this weekend. That was fun.
So anyway, moving on.
I mean, it really basically forces people to deal with painful realities of broken families and sin. And I think a lot of us don't bring those things up or ask them because we are uncomfortable. Like we're uncomfortable with pain. We're uncomfortable with brokenness because it's nothing we can fix. Like none of us can go back in time and fix the painful things. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable just to even sit with somebody in the pain of like, yeah, it's really messed up. You were homeless, and it's messed up. Your parents didn't show you the kind of love that parents are meant to, or they thought you had a perfect marriage, and then boom,
It was over.
it was over. So
yeah, when you said Emma's quote where she said, when I decided to follow Jesus, I didn't know that he was going to follow me too. It made me realize that is the common thread through all of their stories. Like, Jesus followed Rachel. Jesus followed Seiko. Like, everywhere they went, from home to home, from homeless shelter to homeless shelter, and was constantly providing, like, here's some snacks, here's this, here's that, here's a guy to braid your hair and brush your hair.
Oh, that was a beautiful part.
You know?
Yeah, she found a black man in Guam to braid her daughter's hair. That was lovely.
And then with Emma, she was a single mom of a newborn and a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
What? That is so hard.
Yeah.
But that is the common theme. Like, Jesus followed all of these women. And even though they suffered, he was always there.
Yeah. And I think, that highlights why telling our stories is so important, because we see that Jesus follows us. He follows us into the places of pain and suffering, and that he's not scared of it. That's where we see him show up in such powerful ways. And, I think when we hear these stories, it just makes us remember our own stories of where Jesus has followed us into. Telling our stories is so important, because we see that Jesus follows us. He follows us into the places of pain and suffering, and that he's not scared of it. It causes us to be grateful. It builds our faith when we tell our own stories and when we hear other women's stories, because we just remember who God is and who he's been in our lives. And, that's so much of the commandment in the Old Testament of remember the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because we have a pretty short memory when it comes to who God is and what he is actually able to do and who he is able to be in our lives.
And in remembering who God is and what he's done in our lives, we can say, if my past was like this, and if God showed up when I was suffering and when I was at my lowest, then my future, like, it informs my future.
Yes.
Like, it says my future will be okay, because God is the same God as he was in my past as he is now and for my future.
Yeah.
And that's, like, really what faith and hope is.
It is. And I just think too, like, as we share those stories with friends who don't follow Jesus, that actually paints a picture for them of what faith in Jesus looks like.
Yeah.
It shows them, like, hey, this isn't just a check the box on a Sunday thing. This is those moments of darkness and despair where you are convinced you're utterly alone. Actually, Jesus was there, and he is here and will be there. And that, I think, is intriguing to people, because you look at someone like Rachel or Seiko or Emma, and you just think, how could you have gotten through that? And hearing how Jesus has consistently showed up to show them love and provide for them, I think is so attractive to people who don't know Jesus or have misconceptions about who Jesus is or what the Christian community is like. And these stories just paint that picture of what kind of friend Jesus actually is. So,
yeah. And if, as Jesus followers, like, we are supposed to imitate that friend that Jesus is. And I see that as another common theme throughout their stories, is the community that they experienced. Even if it was just one person, God provided that community so that they wouldn't feel alone and so that they could keep going. You know, I think about Rachel and the enriched community that she experienced when she became a follower.
Yeah.
And coming from a family that didn't feel like family, like, God provided a family of faith for her.
And that's a big part of her life now. I mean, like, just having known her and had a friendship with her over these last couple years, that is so core to who she is, like, gathering people around a table to listen and talk and share meals. That place that Jesus reached into her life and impacted her so much, she's now taking that and inviting other people to experience what that's like, which is just, so beautiful.
It's really cool talking with Emma and hearing her story. I mentioned at the end that I have a friend who's getting ready to have a divorce and become a single mom. And a few days later, I met up with my friend. And because of what we talked to Emma about, I was able to remember, like, I need to ask my friend how I can help her right now as she's going through this. And I did. And she gave me a practical way to help her.
That's so great.
And so I'm so excited to be able to serve her in the way that she asked me to, because what she's going through right now is so hard.
Yeah. No matter what the situation, like divorce is just excruciating for the people going through it and for the people who love them. So yeah, that's a good point of when we hear other stories, it makes us begin to reflect and ask the question of how can I show up and be the presence of Jesus to other people? And, you know, okay, if that helped Emma, if that helped Seiko, how could I demonstrate love in that way to other people? Seiko's story especially made me think a lot about the homeless population here in Kansas City and what that looks like, just to provide practical needs, physical needs, but also just the emotional connection and support and willingness just to sit and listen to people, not try and fix them, but to say, yeah, you're going through a rough time right now. Like, I just want to listen to you and be present to you. That was really challenging to me because I think, it's one thing to listen to your friends, but it's another thing to realize like there are hundreds and thousands of people that are living Seiko's story.
Right.
Yeah.
What were some things that made you uncomfortable or things that surprised you in these interviews?
I think one of the things that made me uncomfortable was Rachel talking about the community that supported her, because I think it just made me question and wonder how that's happening in our churches, in my church, in my community.
Oh, okay. So maybe kind of question.
It just was, I
look.
think, kind of convicting of like, are we showing love in the ways that actually draw people into community, that help them to feel loved in tangible ways? It's always kind of a good gut check when you realize like how powerful that is to people, and that it's way too easy just to get caught up into the grind of life and not to invite people into your home, not to invite people into your life. But I think stories like Rachel's just give me a gut check of like, yep, that's what really matters. Like, that's what matters. Building relationships with people, just inviting them into your lives, not having a weird agenda, but just, you know, like showing up to show love and just be open about your faith and your life and not feel like you got to be a weirdo about it. So
that's really good.
That was just challenging to me. So how about for you? What was challenging or awkward or uncomfortable for you?
Yeah, there were a couple things that were a little bit uncomfortable for me that kind of gave me that like churning in my stomach. So when Emma talked about how in her marriage before it ended, she was like, I thought we were happy. Like, I didn't know that we weren't.
Yeah.
And it just
That's
ended.
kind of terrifying.
It is. She's like, we just had a baby. Like, I thought things were going great. And, you know, if I think about that too long, I'm like, oh, if this happened to Emma, like it could happen to me.
Yeah.
And that's really scary.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the thing. All of these stories provided a gut check of this could be any of us. Any of us could find ourselves in a divorce. Any of us could find ourselves homeless. Any of us could find ourselves in a family situation or in friendships where we just don't feel loved or like we belong. And I think all of their stories just really underscored the fact that it does not matter who you are, where you come from, what you've been through. We will all experience suffering of some kind. Like none of us is immune to suffering. And
not to say that like, my husband isn't incredible. Your husband isn't incredible.
Right.
Like, obviously they are.
Yeah.
But I think that what these stories also show us is that the sin and brokenness in this world is real.
It's real.
And it affects all of us. And I'm not exempt from making mistakes.
Yeah.
And my spouse is not exempt from making mistakes.
Yeah. Or that just because things are good now doesn't guarantee that for the future. Like, I think when I hear stories like your mom or other people, you know, I come from a family that has alcoholism in our family history. And, you know, there's times that I just think, you know, who knows what might happen to me in my future. Like, I could end up an alcoholic. Not to say like I'm hitting the bars heavy now or anything like that, but I just think like.
But those things tend to happen slowly. Like, that's the thing. Like, no one sets out and says like, oh, I want to become an alcoholic.
Sure.
Like, you start with like one drink every night with dinner, and then it becomes two, and then it's like before you know it.
Yeah.
So
I
see what you're saying.
But what I'm saying, I guess, is it is prideful to believe that I am good enough or have it together enough or I'm spiritual enough to be immune to falling into addiction, making choices that could lead to a divorce. Any of those things. I think it just is really humbling realizing like it is only the grace of God that keeps drawing us to Jesus, keeps pointing us to run to his love and suffering. asking for the Holy Spirit to heal us of brokenness, of sin, you know, because we can't fix ourselves. Like, we can't fix ourselves. We can't fix others. And I think their stories show us that it's not about getting fixed. It's not about
having it all together.
Right.
Like,
it's about like being present to the love of Jesus and letting him define you, heal you, invite him to trust him when things look horrible and bleak. And
I think just like letting Jesus follow you too, and accepting that he wants to, because these are all fears, okay? And that's all that they are.
Yeah.
And when I talk about the things that made me uncomfortable, as a follower of Christ, I immediately need to go to him and be like, make my mind right.
Yeah.
And we have this book that we bought as a department. It's Prayers from the Heart. And in it, there was this prayer I was reading the other night, and it was an examine of consciousness or unconsciousness.
The prayer of examine. Yeah. Ignatius of Loyola developed that, and it has been one of the single most powerful tools in my prayer toolbox. Like,
well, okay, I don't know if it's the same as that. I don't know. But this one, it was like a prayer from the person's heart, whoever wrote it. And it was like, Jesus, thank you for being with me today. Blah, 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 blah. I don't remember the whole thing. Okay.
So it was that powerful. Huh?
It was that powerful. No, but this was the powerful part.
Okay.
At the bottom, this author had written out God's response to him.
That's cool.
And it said, "Dear little one, I'm happy that you recognized my presence in your life today. But I was there even more than you knew. Like, I showed up in ways you didn't even see or notice. And I'm with you more than you know," or something like that. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, that is truly amazing. Like, just when we think that we see God and where he shows up, he's there in even more ways than we notice. Yeah. And that's the kind of God that he is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. And I think it's compelling to be more open of like, hey, this is where I saw Jesus showing up, and ask people too, like, where did he show up in your day? Because, I mean, I just think like how transformative it would be in our conversations if we began to ask each other, where's Jesus showed up in your day? Where did he show up in your week?
That is a really great question.
You know, as opposed to like, how's your quiet time? Or like, what's church like for you? Because those are spiritual practices and habits, but they're not the presence of the living God. And, you know, when we tell those stories, it just makes Jesus all the more real and powerful because we see that he has been present. So
there's something else that we've been talking about, and it's this word suffering. And I know that word makes a lot of people uncomfortable. I think it makes Christians uncomfortable and non-Christians. So on one side, you have Christians who say, like, suffering is just a part of the faith. And I think that in that, there are extreme ends of the spectrum. Sure. So there are some Christians that are like, you have to suffer for the gospel, and even like go out of their way to try to suffer. And then there are Christians who are like...
the happy, clappy Christians.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we want to stay somewhere...
grounded in the middle.
Somewhere grounded in the middle. Like, Jesus suffered. He said that we will suffer for his name, and that we should count it joy because he suffered. So we should count it joy to suffer along with him, you know? And we also know that by listening to the stories of these women, that when we do suffer is when we see Jesus show up. Yeah. And that builds our faith. Yeah. So then we also have the other side of suffering where non-Christians go, what the heck? I look around and I see this suffering.
I see racism. I see oppression. I see infidelity, greed, all of the things.
Children starving and dying. And so how can God be loving if there is this suffering and brokenness in the world? And so even maybe for some of our listeners today, you're uncomfortable with suffering because maybe you're suffering right now and you don't see where Jesus is showing up. Or you've suffered in the past and it still affects you today. Or you have shame. You are a single mom, like whatever. And you're like, this isn't cool. Yeah. Like, I'm done suffering.
I didn't sign up for this.
I didn't sign up for this when I said I would follow you, Jesus. Yeah. And so what's our word for them today?
I think one of the places I often go to when I am overwhelmed by the suffering in the world or in people's lives is the Psalms, which are basically like King David's angry poems to God. You know, which
it's like a diary.
It really is. And it reminds me, like, we can be completely honest with God. Like, we can just tell him exactly what we're thinking and feeling and be angry with him and tell him, like, I don't trust you right now, and this is not right. And where was your love when I was on the street or my spouse left me? That the invitation he always has to us is come and be with me, no matter how you're feeling, no matter what you're going through. That we don't need to like clean ourselves up, fix ourselves, that he just wants to be with us no matter what we're thinking, feeling, whether we want to be with him or not. And, you know, I think sometimes it can be tempting to want to pretty things up. Like, I actually just read this great book called The Prayer Coin by this author, Elisa Morgan. And she looks at Jesus' prayer of not my will, but yours be done, of, you know, kind of praying with this honest abandon. Like, I don't want this. Like, this is not, you know, like not my will. I don't want these things to happen. But yet, I want your will to be done. I will abandon myself, God, to the things you want. And, you know, it's cool to see how Jesus prays that, of being fully God, fully man, saying, you know, I don't want to die on the cross. I don't want to go through these hard things. But yet, God, I know that you have good in that. And so it's a helpful book, just even wrestling through those suffering things of just how honest can we be with God? And yet, how can we trust him in the midst of the pain and the suffering? So that's been a helpful resource too.
Yeah, that's good. Here at Stonecroft, some of us have been learning a little bit about lamenting and what it means to lament. And there are a lot of really great definitions of lamenting, but one that I like in particular is a lament is a guttural cry to God for his intervention. So it's when we can't do anything to fix our situation.
Yeah.
And we can't do anything to fix the injustices that we see. It is stopping what we're doing and just crying out to God.
Yeah.
And so I would say, like, just lament for a bit over your life, because that's okay. And you're sad and you're suffering and you're grieving, just stay there for a bit.
Yeah.
You know? And then when you're ready to like get up, I think what Emma's story pointed us to is just to put one foot in front of the other. Like, just ask God for the strength that you need today to just keep going.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, I think with Rachel's story, like, when you're at a place where you're desperate, like, just asking God to show up.
Yeah.
And he will. Like, just test him.
Yeah.
I mean, just do
Try it out. Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think we have seen a lot of suffering in these stories, but the thing all of these women have sought after is finding wholeness in their lives, in their relationship with God and with others. And we really would love for each of you to have conversations about what wholeness looks like. And we've got a great resource coming out with Stonecroft called Whole. And it's part of our conversation series that looks at what does it mean to find wholeness in a broken world. And it looks at stories from real women's lives of poverty, of sexual abuse, of building relationships across cultures, of just struggling and suffering. And we know that so many of you have these similar stories. And so if you go to stonecroft.org/store and click on that, you can find the latest in our conversation series. And it's a great resource to sit down and use with some girlfriends, to go through, you know, with a friend who may not know Jesus, but wants to explore, like, what does wholeness look like? So
I think the great thing about the conversation series is that there's no homework involved. Like, you just show up
and do it.
And anyone can facilitate. You don't have to be like this super spiritual leader. Like, you just read word for word the questions and the scriptures, and you're good to go.
Yeah, it's basically a conversation guide for you to get to know your friend better, and for you to see how the Bible actually intersects with real life issues like wholeness and brokenness. So
they're amazing. Anytime we've done a group, just it's been amazing.
Yeah.
So.
And thinking ahead about wholeness and suffering, we have an incredible Series 3 coming up. Maddison, why don't you share the title?
Okay, the title is Because of Her, We Can.
We can do what?
We can
fight
human trafficking.
Okay. Overcome addiction.
And love others even when we've been discriminated against.
Yeah.
So these are really intense interviews, you guys. I'm not going to lie about that. They are real.
They're pretty raw.
Pretty raw. But if you like that kind of thing, and even if you don't, it's going to be worth it, because God has a lot to tell us through these women's stories.
Yeah. As we've been talking about this whole episode, you know, the stories of suffering and Jesus showing up remind us who he is and who we are. And so we hope that you guys tune in for Series 3. We just interviewed some incredible women who God has brought through so much and he is using in powerful ways to help others persevere and show up and keep loving Jesus even when life has been pretty horrific.
Yeah, and I would say even taking those horrific experiences and making something good out of it with their lives. Like these women are dedicating their lives to making a change in the lives of other women who are going through the same thing. So thank you for listening today. We hope that if you haven't had a chance to listen to all of Series 2, that you would go back and listen to those and then give us your feedback. Let us know how the stories of these women's lives have affected you, what questions you have, and maybe what else you'd like to hear about in the future.
Yeah, hit us up on our Facebook page or at connections@stonecroft.org.
Thank you for listening to Ears to Speak today, a podcast sponsored by Stonecroft Ministries. If you liked what you heard, please go right now and subscribe.
Do it. Just subscribe it. Also, if you have feedback, questions, comments, suggestions for what you want to hear in the future, check out our Facebook page, Ears to Speak, or shoot Maddison or myself an email at connections@stonecroft.org. We hope today that you were inspired to listen, learn, and love people better.